By December 1944, the Allied High Command was intoxicated by the fumes of their own success. The liberation of Paris was a memory, and the Siegfried Line appeared to be the final, brittle hurdle before the collapse of the Third Reich. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff at Schiaff viewed the Ardennes Forest as a quiet sector, a recovery ward for battered divisions, and a training ground for green recruits. They called it the Ghost Front, a place where the war seemed to have paused for a winter breath. This systemic failure of intelligence was not born of a lack of data, but of a terminal case of confirmation bias. The Allies were reading German radio traffic through ultra, but they were interpreting it through the lens of their own expectations. They believed the Wehrmacht was a broken beast, capable only of a fighting retreat. They ignored the heavy rail traffic moving toward the Eifel region and dismissed reports of engine noises in the night as local movements. The silence of the Ardennes was not peace, it was a shroud. Deep within the bunker complexes of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler was preparing his final, desperate gambit. Operation Watch on the Rhine was a plan of architectural madness designed to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It relied on two variables that the Allies deemed impossible: a massive concentration of armor in the dense woods, and a prolonged period of foul weather that would ground the predatory Allied air forces. The German plan was built on a foundation of absolute secrecy and ruthless timing. Radio silence was maintained with fanatical discipline, and the movement of the 6th Panzer Army was hidden under the canopy of the winter fog. Hitler was betting everything on a single roll of the dice, placing his faith in the fanatical remnants of the Waffen-SS and the tactical brilliance of commanders like Hasso von Manteuffel. The stage was set for the greatest intelligence failure in American military history. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the horizon of the Ardennes ignited. 2,000 German guns tore the silence apart, a concentrated symphony of steel that signaled the beginning of the end for the Ghost Front. The initial barrage was not merely a tactical preparation. It was a psychological hammer meant to shatter the morale of the inexperienced American units holding the line. In the pre-dawn gloom, the massive shapes of king tigers and panthers began to crawl through the frozen mud. The tactical disasters began almost immediately for the Americans. The 106th Infantry Division, a green unit that had been in the line for only days, found itself bypassed and surrounded on the Schnee Eifel. 2 of its 3 regiments would eventually surrender, marking one of the largest mass capitulations in U.S. history. The systemic failure to recognize the scale of the offensive left these men as sacrificial lambs in the path of a juggernaut. They were never equipped to stop, while the northern and southern shoulders of the bulge were holding with desperate tenacity. The center was a gaping wound. The German spearheads were aiming for the vital road hubs that would allow them to maintain their momentum toward the Meuse River. One name began to dominate the maps of both high commands: Bastogne. A small market town in Belgium, Bastogne was the nexus of 7 major roads. Without it, the German advance would choke on its own logistics. As the German 5th Panzer Army surged westward, Eisenhower finally grasped the magnitude of the crisis. He reached for his only mobile reserve, the Airborne divisions. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were resting in Mourmelon, France, still recovering from the bloodletting of Operation Market Garden. They were ordered to move out in less than 24 hours, many of them lacking winter clothing, ammunition, and even helmets. They were being thrown into the path of a hurricane. The race for Bastogne was a frantic, chaotic scramble. The 101st moved in open-backed trucks through a freezing rain that turned to snow, passing retreating American units who shouted warnings of a total collapse. Elements of the 10th Armored Division and the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were already in the town, forming a thin, desperate screen. These were the unsung heroes of the early hours. Small groups of tankers and engineers fighting suicidal delaying actions at crossroads to buy the paratroopers time to arrive. By the time the 101st had established their perimeter, the German encirclement was nearly complete. The 2nd Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division were closing the ring, cutting the last road to the south. The paratroopers were now the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, surrounded by a force that outnumbered them 5-1 in armor and artillery. The siege had begun in earnest, and the weather had become an enemy as lethal as the SS. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, the conditions defied human endurance. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, impenetrable fog settled over the foxholes. The paratroopers were digging into frozen earth that resisted the shovel-like concrete. They were short on food, low on morphine, and dangerously thin on artillery shells. The medical situation was a catastrophe. The division's medical company had been captured in the opening hours of the encirclement, leaving a single surgeon and a handful of medics to tend to hundreds of wounded in a makeshift hospital. The systemic failure of the Allied supply lines meant that the men in the foxholes were fighting a medieval siege with 20th century weapons. Men wrapped their feet in burlap sacks to stave off trench foot, and ammunition was rationed to the point that snipers were told not to fire unless they had a confirmed officer in their sights. Despite this, the tactical cohesion of the 101st remained unbroken. They utilized a mobile defense, shifting their limited resources to whichever part of the circle was being threatened by German probes. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal demand for surrender from the German commander, citing the hopelessness of the American position. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His initial, instinctive response was a single word that would become the stuff of military legend: nuts. When the Germans asked for a clarification, the official reply was typed out. To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. This gesture was more than bravado. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare that galvanized the defenders. But the irony of the situation was that the Germans were also reaching their breaking point. Their supply lines were stretched across miles of clogged, snow-covered roads, and their tanks were running dry of fuel. The siege was becoming a race against time for both sides. If the weather did not break, the 101st would starve or be overrun. If the weather did break, the German offensive would be vaporized by the Allied air power. The unsung heroes of this period were the supply clerks, the cooks, and the mechanics who took up rifles to fill gaps in the line. At the Novel sector, Team Desobry fought a brutal delaying action against superior German armor, holding a crucial ridge until they were nearly annihilated. These small, localized stands were the friction that slowed the German clock, second by agonizing second. The German High Command began to realize that their entire offensive was being strangled by a single, stubborn town that refused to die. Then, on the night of December 23rd, the stars appeared. The high-pressure system the Allies had prayed for finally arrived, sweeping away the fog and exposing the German columns to the full fury of the 9th Air Force. C-47 transport planes filled the sky over Bastogne, dropping hundreds of tons of supplies, ammunition, and medical gear. The siege was not over, but the tide had shifted. The German commanders knew that their window of opportunity was closing, yet Hitler ordered one final, massive assault on the perimeter. The final German thrust came on Christmas Day. It was a desperate attempt to break the perimeter from the west, using the last of the available armor. German tanks actually managed to penetrate the lines near Hemrul, but they were hunted down by paratroopers with bazookas and the remaining tank destroyers of the 705th. The defense held, but the cost was staggering. The snowy fields around the town were littered with the charred hulks of panzers and the frozen bodies of men who had been neighbors only weeks before. While the 101st held the center, General George S. Patton was performing a logistical miracle to the south. He had pivoted his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of a winter storm, moving 3 divisions across 100 miles of treacherous roads to strike the southern flank of the German Bulge. On December 26th, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division smashed through the German ring at Assenois, finally linking up with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was officially broken. The relief of Bastogne did not mean the end of the fighting. The battle for the Ardennes would continue for another month as the Allies ground down the German salient in a brutal war of attrition. But the strategic heart of the German offensive had been torn out at the crossroads of Bastogne. Hitler had spent his last reserves of men, machines, and fuel on a gamble that failed because he underestimated the resilience of the individual soldier when the systems of command had collapsed. The final tragic conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge was the sheer scale of the waste. Over 19,000 Americans died, and the German losses were even more catastrophic, exceeding 100,000 casualties. For the Germans, it was the end of their ability to wage offensive war. For the Allies, it was a sobering reminder that arrogance is the most dangerous enemy on the battlefield. The Ghost Front had claimed its victims, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a generation of men who would never forget the cold. Looking back through the lens of history, the Siege of Bastogne stands as a testament to the irony of war. The very forest that was supposed to be a place of rest became a slaughterhouse. The elite paratroopers who were meant to drop from the clouds were forced to fight like cavemen in frozen holes, and the German army, which prided itself on the fluid mobility of blitzkrieg, was brought to a standstill by a few thousand men who simply refused to move. The philosophical takeaway of this conflict is found in the silence that returned to the Ardennes after the guns fell still. It is a reminder that structural failures at the highest levels of power are almost always paid for by the blood of the lowest-ranking individuals. The victory was not won by the brilliance of the generals in Versailles, but by the stubbornness of the privates in the snow. It was a victory of the human spirit over the failures of the human intellect. The snows of December 1944 have long since melted, but the echoes of the Ardennes remain. They speak of a time when the world held its breath, waiting to see if the darkness would prevail. They speak of the men who stood in the path of the storm and became the breakwater upon which the last hope of a tyrant was shattered. Bastogne was not just a town. It was the point where the momentum of history was forcibly redirected. As the sun sets over the monuments that now dot the Belgian countryside, we are left with the image of the foxholes, still visible as shallow depressions in the earth. They are the scars of a continent, the permanent footprints of a struggle that defined the modern age. The story of Bastogne is a story of what happens when the impossible becomes the inevitable, and when the courage of the few outweighs the calculations of the many. In the end, the defense of Bastogne was the final, definitive answer to the question of Allied resolve. It proved that even when surprised, even when surrounded, and even when abandoned by the weather and the high command, the line would hold. The Battered Bastards of Bastogne entered the history books not as victims of a systemic failure, but as the architects of a systemic victory. The war would continue for several more months, moving toward the heart of Germany and the inevitable fall of Berlin. But the spirit of the German army died in the snow of the Ardennes. They had given their all, and it had not been enough. The road to peace was paved with the sacrifices made in those dark woods, a debt that can never be fully repaid, but must always be remembered. The wind still blows through the pines of the Ardennes, cold and biting, a spectral reminder of the winter of '44. It carries the ghosts of the screaming eagles and the whispers of 1,000 unrecorded heroisms. It is a place of profound quiet, a peace earned in the most violent furnace of the 20th century. And in that quiet, the legacy of the defenders remains as solid as the stones of the town they refused to yield. This was the Siege of Bastogne, A moment of absolute clarity in the fog of war. A testament to the power of the human will when pushed to the absolute brink. It remains a stark reminder that in the face of total collapse, the only thing that stands between order and chaos is the individual soldier shivering in the dark, waiting for the dawn. The light eventually came, but it was bought with a price that history will never forget.
Sleeping in a winter's breath, a recovery ward in the valley of death. Shafe was intoxicated by the fumes of success, while the wolves lay prepared for a final caress. 2,000 guns ignite the morning gray. Adolf last gamble to take the world away. Through the Eiffel fog, the king tigers crawl to split the alliance and watch the empire fall. Green recruits and the screaming eagle's pride, thrown into the hurricane with nowhere to hide. No winter coats, no ammo in the bin, just a foxhole in the ice to keep the devil in. Oh, Bastogne, the nexus of the roads, carrying the weight of the heavy iron loads. Surrounded by the SS, outnumbered 5 to 1. The battered bastards standing when the day is done. From the frozen earth to the fog in the sky, nuts is the answer. We're not going to die. The Schnee Eiffel surrendered, a gaping bloody wound. But in the market town, the perimeter is tuned. McAuliffe's iron word echoes through the snow, a psychological hammer to the hunters below. Morphine is gone and the bandages are red, wrapping feet in burlap while they count the dead. Waiting for the weather, waiting for the light to bring the 9th Air Force back into the fight. December 23rd, the stars begin to shine. C-47s dropping heaven on the line. Patterns rolling north through the blizzard and the mud. Redemption for the ghost front board in American blood. Oh, Bastogne, the nexus of the roads, carrying the weight of the heavy iron loads. Surrounded by the SS, Sir, we're not going to die. The snow has melted, but the scars remain deep. The screaming eagles have a promise to keep. The victory of the private in the Ardennes snow, where the spirit stood tall and the darkness had to go.